July 11, 1943, 0342 hours, Prokhorovka, Soviet Union. The transmission housing of T-34 tank number 2347 was vibrating at a frequency that Tank Commander Sergeant Yuri Petrov could feel through the soles of his boots, through the metal floor of the fighting compartment, through his spine. It was the wrong kind of vibration, the kind that meant the gearbox was tearing itself apart from the inside, the kind that had already killed 87 tanks in the 5th Guards Tank Army before they could fire a single shot at the Germans massing 15 kilometers to the south. At 0347 hours, the vibration stopped abruptly, replaced by a grinding scream of metal shearing against metal, and Petrov's T-34 rolled to a halt 400 meters from the assembly point, where 850 Soviet tanks were preparing for the largest armored clash in human history. The Germans would attack at dawn with 600 Panzers, Tiger tanks with 80 mm guns that could penetrate a T-34's armor at 2,000 meters, and the Red Army's answer was sitting dead on the side of a dirt road with a transmission that had destroyed itself through a mechanical flaw that Soviet tankers called the death shake. Petrov climbed out of the turret and dropped to the ground, his hands shaking not from fear but from rage at the betrayal of machinery. Around him in the pre-dawn darkness, 34 other T-34s sat immobilized, their crews standing beside them in defeat, watching as the tanks that would survive to reach the battle line drove past them toward positions that would determine whether the German summer offensive succeeded or failed. Behind the paralyzed armor, 750 kilometers to the east in the Ural mountain city of Nizhny Tagil, a 19-year-old factory welder named Dmitry Volkov was loading 2,400 circular steel washers into wooden crates at tank factory number 983. Each washer measured 42 millimeters in diameter, 3 millimeters thick, with a 24 millimeter center hole precisely machined to tolerances of plus or minus 0.05 millimeters. Each washer cost 9 cents to manufacture. Each washer, when installed in a specific location inside the transmission assembly of a T-34 tank, would prevent the harmonic vibration that had been destroying Soviet armor at a rate that threatened to hand victory to the Germans through mechanical failure rather than battlefield superiority. Volkov had discovered the solution 16 days earlier, not through engineering calculations or metallurgical analysis, but through the simple observation of a factory worker who spent 11 hours daily welding transmission components and had noticed a pattern in the failures. The official Soviet investigation had blamed poor quality steel, insufficient lubrication, operator error, and a dozen other factors, while 340 tanks broke down during July's first week of combat operations. Volkov had blamed vibration, tested his theory with a single washer placed as a spacer between the second gear assembly and its bearing housing, and watched his modified transmission run for 72 continuous hours at full load without failure. Now at 0359 hours on July 11th, while Sergeant Petrov was discovering that his tank's transmission had become a block of fused metal, Volkov was climbing into a commandeered Studebaker truck loaded with enough washers to repair 600 tanks. The factory director, Colonel Engineer Mikhail Popov, had given him a military travel authorization, a 9mm pistol, 47 liters of gasoline, and orders to reach the 5th Guards Tank Army's forward maintenance depot at Prokhorovka before the German attack began at dawn on July 12th. The distance was 2,850 kilometers. Volkov had 28 hours. The truck's maximum speed on the damaged wartime roads was 65 kilometers per hour. The mathematics of impossibility were precise and unforgiving, but Soviet logistics operated under different rules when the alternative was defeat. The transmission problem had first appeared in March 1943, when the Red Army received the first batches of T-34 Model 1943 tanks, featuring improved armor and a more powerful 76.2 mm gun. The modifications added 940 kilograms to the tank's combat weight, increasing stress on the 5-speed gearbox that had been designed for the lighter model 1942. Soviet tankers began reporting failures at an alarming rate, with transmission seizing after an average of 74 kilometers of operation versus the expected 200-kilometer service life. By June, the failure rate had reached 23%, meaning nearly 1 in 4 tanks was breaking down before reaching combat positions. The Soviet tank production system, which had evacuated entire factories eastward in 1941 and rebuilt them in the Urals under conditions that killed thousands of workers from exhaustion and cold, had created a manufacturing infrastructure capable of producing White 300 T-34s monthly. But quantity meant nothing if the tanks couldn't reach the battlefield. German intelligence had detected the transmission crisis through radio intercepts and prisoner interrogations, and Generalfeldmarschall Erich von Manstein had designed Operation Citadel's southern offensive specifically to exploit Soviet mechanical vulnerabilities. The German plan assumed that Soviet armor would suffer a 30% mechanical failure rate during movement to contact, reducing effective tank strength from 850 to approximately 600 before the first shot was fired. Dmitry Volkov was the son of a machinist who had died in 1938 during Stalin's purges, leaving his family with a tainted political record that made advancement nearly impossible. Volkov had been assigned to Tank Factory No. 183 as a welder in January 1942 at age 17, and had spent 18 months performing the same repetitive task, welding the transmission housing seam at Station 47 of the assembly line. He welded 63 transmission housings during each 11-hour shift, making the same weld 23,000 times between January 1942 and July 1943. The repetition had given him an intimate understanding of how the transmission assembly vibrated under different conditions, and by July 1943, Volkov could diagnose a transmission problem by placing his hand on the housing and feeling the vibration pattern. On June 25, 1943, at 1740 hours, Volkov was welding transmission housing number 4712 when he noticed an unusual harmonic resonance in the metal. The housing was vibrating at what felt like 180 cycles per minute, a frequency that matched the second gear engagement speed. Volkov stopped his welding torch, placed both hands flat against the warm metal, and felt the vibration building to a destructive amplitude. He walked to the testing station 40 meters down the assembly line, where transmissions were run under load for 30 minutes before installation in tank hulls, and watched as the test operator engaged second gear. The vibration began immediately, a rhythmic pulsing that grew stronger as the gear teeth meshed under load. Volkov returned to his welding station, pulled a 9-cent steel washer from the parts bin where miscellaneous hardware was stored, and walked back to the testing station. The test operator, a 54-year-old veteran machinist named Boris Kutuzov, looked at Volkov with the tired irritation of a skilled worker being interrupted by a teenage welder. Volkov explained his theory in 3 sentences. The second gear assembly was positioned 3 millimeters too close to its bearing housing, creating a harmonic vibration that propagated through the entire gearbox and eventually caused catastrophic failure. A single washer, placed between the gear assembly and bearing housing as a spacer, would dampen the vibration and prevent the failure. Kutuzov's expression changed from irritation to interest when Volkov demonstrated the problem by having him place his hand on the transmission housing during second gear operation. They installed the washer at 1753 hours, reassembled the transmission, and ran the test cycle. The vibration disappeared. They ran the transmission for 2 hours at full load, no vibration. They ran it for 8 hours overnight, no vibration. They ran it for 72 continuous hours, simulating 840 kilometers of operation. The transmission showed no signs of abnormal wear, no heating, no vibration. Kutuzov reported the discovery to the factory's chief engineer on June 28th, and by July 1st, the modification had been approved for immediate implementation. Tank Factory No. 183 began installing washers in all new production T-34s but 4,800 tanks were already in service at the front with the fatal design flaw. The modification required disassembling the transmission, removing the second gear assembly, installing the washer, and reassembling everything with proper torque specifications. The work took 4 hours per tank when performed at factory maintenance facilities, 6 hours when performed by field maintenance battalions, and was effectively impossible to perform in forward combat areas where tank crews lacked the specialized tools and clean conditions required for transmission work. The Soviet solution was characteristically direct. Send the washers to the front with someone who understood the modification, establish rapid repair stations behind the front lines, and fix as many tanks as possible before the Germans attacked. Colonel Engineer Popov selected Volkov for the mission at 0200 hours on July 11th, pulling him from the night shift with orders to report immediately to the factory director's office. Volkov arrived to find Popov standing over a map of the Soviet Union with a red circle marked around Prokhorovka, 2,050 kilometers to the west. The colonel's instructions were precise. Take the washers, take the truck, drive without stopping, and reach the 5th Guards Tank Army before the Germans broke through. The modification procedure would be explained to Army maintenance personnel by written instructions that Volkov carried in a sealed envelope. But Volkov himself was to remain with the forward units to supervise the modifications and ensure they were performed correctly. At 04:15 hours on July 11th, Volkov was driving west on the Sverdlovsk-Chelyabinsk highway at 64 kilometers per hour, which was as fast as the overloaded Studebaker could manage on roads that were more suggestion than surface. The truck carried 2,400 washers in 24 wooden crates, each crate containing 100 washers packed in grease-soaked paper to prevent rust. The total cargo weighed 174 kilograms, plus Volkov's weight of 68 kilograms, plus 47 liters of gasoline in jerry cans, plus tools, spare parts, food, water, and the 9mm pistol that Volkov had never fired. The truck's suspension groaned under the load, but the Lend-Lease American vehicle was built for exactly this kind of abuse, and it kept moving westward through the dawn. By 0900 hours, Volkov had covered 320 kilometers, passing through Chelyabinsk and continuing west toward Magnitogorsk. The road was clogged with military traffic moving in both directions, supply convoys heading west toward the front, casualty trucks returning east toward hospitals, refugee columns shuffling away from the advancing Germans. Volkov had military priority papers that allowed him to commandeer fuel from any military depot, but the depots were running low because every liter of gasoline was needed at Kursk, where the largest tank battle in history was about to begin. He refueled at a depot outside Magnitogorsk at 1420 hours, adding 35 liters that would carry him another 400 kilometers westward. At Prokhorovka, 2,200 kilometers to the west, the 5th Guards Tank Army was discovering the full extent of its mechanical crisis. Of the 850 T-34s assigned to the Army for the coming battle, 87 had suffered complete transmission failures during movement from assembly areas to combat positions. Another 134 showed early signs of the death shake, abnormal vibration in second gear, increasing temperatures in the gearbox housing, metal particles in the lubricating oil. The Army's mechanical officer, Colonel Technical Service Grigory Vasin, was calculating failure projections that suggested 340 tanks would be immobilized by mechanical problems before the battle began, reducing effective armor strength by 40%. The Germans would attack with 600 tanks. The Soviets would meet them with approximately 510 operational T-34s, achieving numerical parity rather than the 1.4 to 1 advantage that Soviet doctrine required for successful defensive operations. Vasin received notification of the incoming washer shipment at 1640 hours on July 11th through an encrypted radio message from Stavka, the Soviet High Command. The message was characteristically cryptic. Factory modification arriving 11 July evening. Prepare maintenance stations for transmission repair. Priority 1: Implementation. Vassin had no idea what modification was coming, how it worked, or whether it would actually solve the crisis. He ordered the establishment of 3 rapid repair stations at distances of 5, 8, and 12 kilometers behind the main defensive positions, each station staffed with 15 mechanics and equipped with transmission assembly tools, spare parts, and portable hoists capable of lifting a 27-ton T-34. At 23:20 hours on July 11th, Volkov's truck rolled into the 5th Guards Tank Army's maintenance area after 18 hours and 2,850 kilometers of continuous driving. Volkov had stopped only twice, once to refuel at Magnitogorsk and once to repair a broken fan belt outside Voronezh. He had driven through 2 thunderstorms, past 3 burning villages, around 4 destroyed bridges, and through 6 military checkpoints where his priority papers had gotten him through without delay. He was exhausted, hungry, dehydrated, and covered in road dust, but the 2,400 washers were intact, and the sealed envelope containing installation instructions was unbroken. Colonel Vassin met Volkov at the maintenance area entrance, read the installation instructions by flashlight in 90 seconds, and immediately ordered all 3 repair stations to begin modification work. The procedure was straightforward: drain the transmission oil, remove the access plate, extract the second gear assembly, install the washer, reassemble, refill with oil, test. The work took 3 hours and 45 minutes per tank, with experienced mechanics working in pairs. Vassin had 45 mechanics and approximately 8 hours before the German attack began at dawn. The mathematics were slightly more favorable than the mathematics of Volkov's impossible drive, but still unforgiving. At around 30 hours on July 12th, the first modified T-34 completed its test run and was declared operational. By Aero 300 hours, 12 tanks had been modified. By Aero 500 hours, 34 tanks. By Aero 630 hours, as the sun rose over the rolling steppes south of Prokhorovka, 58 tanks had received the modification. Another 163 tanks were waiting in line at the 3 repair stations, their crews standing nervously beside their armor, watching mechanics work with desperate speed. The German attack was scheduled to begin at 0830 hours, giving the repair stations 2 more hours to save as many tanks as possible. Dmitry Volkov was at repair station number 1, personally supervising the installation of washers in each tank, checking tolerances, verifying proper assembly, test running each transmission. At 0745 hours, he installed washer number 1847 in the transmission of tank number 2347, the same tank that had broken down 400 meters from the assembly point 27 hours earlier. Sergeant Petrov watched the modification with the skeptical expression of a tanker who had learned not to trust promises about fixes, but when the transmission was reassembled and tested, the death shake was gone, replaced by smooth operation and no abnormal vibration. At 0823 hours on July 12, 1943, as German panzer formations began their final approach, march toward the Soviet defensive positions at Prokhorovka, 73 T-34 tanks, equipped with Volkov's 9-cent washer modification, were moving into combat positions alongside 777 unmodified tanks. The modified tanks represented 8.6% of Soviet armor strength, but their 91% mechanical reliability rate versus the 34% reliability rate of unmodified tanks would prove decisive in the coming battle. The German attack would begin in 7 minutes, and Volkov was climbing into the back of a truck heading toward repair station number 2 with another crate of washers, racing against time to save more tanks before the ground shook with the concussion of German artillery and the battle for Prokhorovka began. The first German shell impacted 200 meters south of repair station number 2 at 0830 hours exactly, throwing up a column of black earth and smoke that hung in the windless morning air like a punctuation mark announcing the end of preparation and the beginning of violence. Dmitry Volkov felt the concussion through the truck bed where he sat surrounded by crates of washers, and his first coherent thought was not about his own survival, but about the 1,073 washers still waiting to be installed in tanks that would break down without them. The truck driver, a 43-year-old Ukrainian named Pavel Kostin, who had been driving supply vehicles since 1941, made an immediate calculation based on 2 years of experience with German artillery patterns. The impact point was 200 meters south, which meant the German forward observers were ranging for the repair stations visible 400 meters behind the main defensive line. The next salvo would land closer, probably 50 meters closer, and the third salvo would hit the repair stations directly. Kostin had perhaps 90 seconds to get Volkov and the washers to cover before the killing began in earnest. He accelerated the truck toward a revetment 140 meters to the north, a position dug by engineers 48 hours earlier, specifically to protect maintenance operations from observed artillery fire. The second salvo landed at 0831 hours, 6 shells in rapid succession, impacts walking northward in 30-meter intervals from the first shell's crater. The closest explosion was 78 meters from the truck, close enough that Volkov felt gravel from the impact pepper the canvas truck cover and heard the whip crack of shrapnel passing overhead. Kostin reached the revetment at 0832 hours, drove the truck down the earthen ramp into the protected area, and killed the engine. Around them, the carefully organized chaos of battlefield maintenance was accelerating into pure chaos as mechanics worked to complete modifications while German artillery searched for targets. At repair station number 200 meters to the east, Colonel Vason was watching through binoculars as German armor appeared on the horizon 4 kilometers to the south. He counted 87 tanks in the first wave, a mixture of Panzer IVs with 75mm guns and Tigers with 88mm guns that could kill a T-34 at ranges where Soviet guns were ineffective. Behind the first wave, another 120 tanks were visible, and behind them, smoke and dust suggested hundreds more. The German attack was developing exactly as Soviet intelligence had predicted. A massive armored thrust along a narrow front, concentrated force designed to achieve breakthrough, followed by exploitation deep into Soviet rear areas. The Soviet defensive plan was equally straightforward. Meet the German thrust with massed armor, accept horrendous casualties in close-range fighting where Soviet numerical superiority and T-34 maneuverability could offset German technological advantages and hold the Germans in place long enough for reinforcements to arrive from the north. The plan required 850 operational tanks. Vason had 777 tanks that had reached their combat positions, of which 73 had received Volkov's modification, and 704 had not. The mathematics of mechanical failure suggested that by noon, after 3 hours of combat operations involving high-speed maneuvering and sustained gearbox stress, he would have approximately 310 operational tanks, 66 modified tanks with a projected 91% reliability rate, and 244 unmodified tanks surviving from an initial force of 704 with a 34% reliability rate. The German plan assumed Soviet mechanical losses would reduce effective armor strength to approximately 510 tanks at battle initiation, declining to 350 tanks by noon. German intelligence was accurate about the initial projection, but unaware of the midnight modification program. The difference between Vason's actual projected strength of 310 tanks and the German projected strength of 350 tanks was negligible, a margin of 12% that would normally be absorbed by combat attrition. But the Germans had made one critical miscalculation. They had assumed Soviet mechanical failures would occur randomly across all tank units, weakening formations uniformly. The reality was that mechanical failures would occur almost exclusively in unmodified tanks, leaving the 73 modified tanks as an increasingly important core of reliable armor as the battle progressed. At 0847 hours, Soviet tank commander Lieutenant Colonel Vasily Kryukin gave the order for the 18th and 29th Tank Corps to advance from their defensive positions and meet the German thrust in the open terrain south of Prokhorovka. The Soviet doctrine of meeting engagement called for aggressive maneuvering to close the range gap where German guns held advantage, accepting heavy initial casualties to reach the 800-meter range where T-34 guns became effective. Kryukin's force consisted of 374 T-34s, of which 31 had been modified with Volkov's washers. The modified tanks were concentrated in the 181st Tank Brigade under Major Mikhail Korzun, who had received explicit orders from Vasin to preserve his modified tanks as a mobile reserve rather than committing them to the initial assault. The German first wave opened fire at 0853 hours at a range of 2,400 meters. Tiger tanks with their superior optics and stabilized guns began hitting Soviet armor almost immediately, brewing up T-34s with single shots that penetrated frontal armor and detonated ammunition stored beneath the turret. Soviet doctrine called for closing the range through high-speed maneuver while accepting casualties, and the T-34 commanders executed perfectly, accelerating to maximum speed of 55 kilometers per hour, while zigzagging to complicate German ranging. The Soviet return fire was largely ineffective at ranges beyond 1,600 meters, but the aggressive advance forced German tanks to displace and maneuver, disrupting their carefully prepared firing positions. At 0908 hours, the first mechanical failure occurred in the 18th Tank Corps. Tank Commander Sergeant Boris Melnikov's T-34 began experiencing the death shake at precisely the worst moment, while accelerating at high speed across broken terrain under heavy fire. The transmission seized completely 14 seconds later, and the tank rolled to a stop 150 meters from the nearest German position, immobilized in the open kill zone. Melnikov and his crew abandoned the tank under fire, running 200 meters to a shell crater where they waited for rescue. The abandoned T-34 received 7 direct hits over the next 20 minutes as German gunners used it for target practice. By 0930 hours, after 1 hour of combat operations, the mechanical attrition was accelerating exactly as Vasin had projected. The 18th Tank Corps had lost 47 tanks to mechanical failure out of 187 tanks committed, a failure rate of 25% that matched the expected curve. The 29th Tank Corps had lost 34 mechanical casualties from 187 tanks, an 18% failure rate slightly better than expected due to less aggressive maneuvering. Combined combat casualties from German fire had reached 83 tanks destroyed and 27 damaged but recoverable. Total Soviet armor losses after 1 hour, 191 tanks, leaving 183 operational out of the initial force of 374. The modified tanks in the 181st Tank Brigade had suffered 0 mechanical failures. Major Korzun's 31 modified T-34s remained in reserve positions 2,400 meters behind the main engagement line, their crews watching through binoculars as unmodified tanks fought and died in the killing zone to the south. Korzun understood the mathematics of his situation with brutal clarity. By noon, his 31 tanks would represent approximately 20% of operational Soviet armor in the Prokhorovka sector, despite representing only 8% of the initial force. If the battle continued into afternoon, his modified tanks would constitute an increasingly dominant percentage of surviving armor. At 0945 hours, German forces achieved their first tactical penetration, pushing a salient 800 meters deep into Soviet defensive positions. The breakthrough was spearheaded by 23 Tiger tanks that had systematically destroyed Soviet armor at long range, creating a corridor through which German Panzer IVs began to advance. Soviet doctrine for countering breakthrough was immediate counterattack from the flanks, but the flanking units had been weakened by mechanical failures and combat losses to the point where counterattack was problematic. Vasin made the decision to commit the 181st Tank Brigade with its 31 modified tanks, gambling that their mechanical reliability would prove decisive in close-range maneuvering combat. Korzun received his attack orders at 0952 hours. Advance south. Engage the German salient from the western flank, close to point-blank range where T-34 maneuverability advantages could offset Tiger firepower, and hold the Germans in place until reinforcements arrived. The attack would require high-speed movement across 2,400 meters of open terrain, followed by sustained close-range combat involving rapid maneuvering, frequent gear changes, and maximum stress on transmissions. Korzun understood that this was exactly the situation that destroyed unmodified tanks, and exactly the situation where modified tanks would prove their value. The 181st Tank Brigade began its attack run at 8:09:58 hours, 31 T-34s advancing in diamond formation at maximum speed. German observers spotted the movement immediately and shifted artillery fire to interdict the advance, but the Soviet tanks were moving too fast for effective engagement by indirect fire. Tiger tanks at the point of the German salient attempted to engage at 2,100 meters but struggled to hit fast-moving targets at that range. The modified T-34s reached the 1,600-meter line at 1,003 hours and opened fire while still at high speed, scoring their first kill at 1,550 meters when a T-34 round penetrated the side armor of a Panzer IV that had exposed its flank while maneuvering. The close-range engagement that followed was exactly the kind of chaos that Soviet doctrine was designed to create, and German doctrine was designed to prevent. T-34s maneuvered aggressively at ranges between 800 and 1,200 meters, using superior mobility to complicate German ranging while maintaining continuous fire. The modified transmissions performed flawlessly under maximum stress, shifting smoothly through all 5 gears during the rapid acceleration and deceleration that characterized tank combat at close range. German tanks, designed for long-range precision gunnery from static or slowly moving positions, struggled to maintain target tracking against opponents moving at speeds up to 55 kilometers per hour and changing direction every 8 to 12 seconds. At 10:27 hours, the 181st Tank Brigade achieved its first mechanical advantage that translated directly into tactical success. A German Tiger tank commander, Hauptmann Franz Becker, was tracking a T-34 at 900 meters range when his target suddenly accelerated and changed direction. Becker's gunner lost the target in his sights and required 6 seconds to reacquire, during which time the T-34 closed to 750 meters and fired. The shot penetrated the Tiger's thinner side armor, detonating ammunition and killing the entire crew. The engagement was unremarkable, except for one detail. The T-34's ability to accelerate rapidly and change direction at high speed depended entirely on a transmission that could handle sustained high-stress operation without failure. Unmodified T-34s attempting the same maneuver were increasingly discovering that their transmissions couldn't sustain the punishment. By 1100 hours, after 2 hours and 30 minutes of combat operations, the mechanical failure rate in unmodified Soviet tanks had accelerated to catastrophic levels. The 18th Tank Corps reported 87 mechanical failures from its initial force of 187 tanks, a 47% failure rate. The 29th Tank Corps reported 76 failures from 187 tanks, a 41% failure rate. Combined with combat losses, total Soviet tank strength in the Prokhorovka sector had declined from 374 to 124 operational tanks. The 181st Tank Brigade with its modified tanks had lost 4 tanks to German fire but 0 to mechanical failure, leaving 27 operational tanks that now represented 22% of total Soviet armor, despite representing only 8% of the initial force. The German attack was faltering not because of Soviet tactical brilliance or superior equipment, but because of a mathematical reality that German commanders couldn't fully comprehend. Soviet tank units were losing mechanical cohesion faster than they were losing tanks to German fire, but the losses were not uniformly distributed. Unmodified tanks were disappearing from the battlefield at accelerating rates, while modified tanks continued fighting with near-perfect mechanical reliability. From the German perspective, the battlefield appeared to be inexplicably concentrating Soviet armor in specific sectors, while other sectors collapsed into chaos. At Repair Station Number 2, Dmitry Volkov and the maintenance crews had continued working throughout the battle, installing washers in tanks that arrived from secondary positions to receive the modification before being committed to combat. Between 0830 and 1100 hours, despite German artillery fire that had destroyed one repair station and damaged another, mechanics had completed modifications on 47 additional tanks. These newly modified tanks were being fed into combat as they became available, creating a steady reinforcement flow that partially offset the mechanical attrition in unmodified units. Colonel Vassin, directing operations from his command post 3 kilometers behind the main battle line, was receiving reports that confirmed his most optimistic projections. Modified tanks were maintaining 89% operational readiness after 2.5 hours of intensive combat operations, slightly below the theoretical 91% but far above the 28% readiness rate in unmodified tanks. The difference translated into combat power. At current attrition rates, by 1400 hours, after 5.5 hours of combat, modified tanks would represent approximately 60% of operational Soviet armor, despite representing less than 15% of initial strength. If the battle continued into late afternoon, virtually 100% of surviving Soviet tanks would be modified units. At 1143 hours, German Generalfeldmarschall Erich von Manstein received battlefield reports indicating that Soviet resistance was not collapsing as predicted. German intelligence had projected Soviet armor strength at 1143 hours to be approximately 180 tanks, declining rapidly due to combined combat and mechanical attrition. Actual Soviet armor strength was 147 tanks, below the projection, but not collapsing at the accelerated rate that would indicate systemic mechanical failure. Von Manstein's intelligence officer, Oberst Heinrich Müller, noted that Soviet tank losses appeared to have plateaued rather than continuing to accelerate, suggesting either improved Soviet maintenance procedures or external reinforcement. The reality was simpler than Müller suspected. Soviet losses had plateaued because the population of mechanically vulnerable tanks had been largely eliminated from the battlefield, leaving a core of mechanically reliable modified tanks that would continue fighting indefinitely. The German plan had assumed linear attrition, where Soviet tank strength would decline continuously throughout the day. Instead, attrition was following a curve where initial losses were heavy, but subsequent losses declined as the proportion of reliable tanks increased. The Germans were unknowingly fighting two different Soviet armies: a mechanically fragile force that was rapidly disintegrating, and a mechanically robust force that was emerging as the dominant factor on the battlefield. At 12:14 hours, the battle's decisive moment occurred not through brilliant tactical maneuver or technological superiority, but through the cumulative effect of thousands of successful gear shifts in modified transmissions. Major Korsun's 181st Tank Brigade, now reduced to 24 operational tanks from mechanical losses 0 and combat losses 7, received orders to spearhead a counterattack against the German salient that had penetrated 100 meters into Soviet positions. The counterattack required rapid movement, aggressive maneuvering, and sustained close-range combat, exactly the conditions that destroyed unmodified transmissions. Korsun's modified tanks executed the counterattack with mechanical precision that was impossible for unmodified units. They advanced 2,900 meters in 11 minutes, engaged German armor at ranges between 600 and 1,000 meters, destroyed 17 Panzer IVs and 4 Tigers through aggressive flanking maneuvers, and forced the German salient to contract. The success was attributable not to superior Soviet tactics or better Soviet equipment, but to the simple fact that Korsun's tanks could maneuver at high speed for extended periods without mechanical failure, while German tanks operated at the edge of their fuel capacity and Soviet unmodified tanks were breaking down at catastrophic rates. By 13:30 hours, after 5 hours of combat operations, the Battle of Prokhorovka had reached its crisis point. German forces had committed 612 tanks and had lost 163 to combat, 47 Tigers, 89 Panzer IVs, and 27 Panzer IIIs. Soviet forces had committed 850 tanks and had lost 687 to combined combat and mechanical failure, 403 to mechanical failure, 284 to German fire. The raw numbers suggested German tactical victory, but the operational reality was different. German losses were permanent. Destroyed tanks would not return to combat. Soviet mechanical losses were potentially recoverable. 340 of the 403 mechanically failed tanks could be repaired with Volkov's washers and returned to service within 24 hours. The German attack stalled at 13:47 hours when von Manstein received reports that Soviet tank resistance was not collapsing despite heavy losses. German forces were low on fuel, low on ammunition, and facing an opponent that should have been mechanically exhausted but somehow maintained combat effectiveness. Von Manstein made the decision to consolidate gains and prepare for renewed attack the following day, a delay that would prove fatal to German offensive prospects. Soviet reinforcements were already moving toward Prokhorovka from the north, and by July 13th, the Red Army would achieve overwhelming numerical superiority that no amount of German tactical skill could overcome. At 14:30 hours on July 12, 1943, the Battle of Prokhorovka entered its final phase. German forces began withdrawing under pressure from Soviet counterattacks, leaving behind 340 destroyed or immobilized tanks on the battlefield. Soviet forces, exhausted and depleted, made no attempt to pursue, focusing instead on recovering damaged tanks and establishing defensive positions. The battle had cost the Red Army 687 tanks total, 284 destroyed by German fire, and 403 immobilized by mechanical failure. But 340 of those mechanical failures would be repaired and returned to service by July 14th, while the 284 combat losses would be replaced by new production from factories that were building 1,300 T-34s monthly. Dmitry Volkov spent the afternoon of July 12th moving between repair stations, supervising the installation of washers in mechanically failed tanks that were being recovered from the battlefield. Between 14:30 and 2200 hours, maintenance crews completed modifications on 147 tanks that had suffered transmission failures during the morning's combat. These tanks would be operational again by dawn on July 13th, ready to resist any renewed German attack. An additional 193 mechanically failed tanks were transported to rear area maintenance facilities where they would receive modifications over the following 48 hours. The strategic implications of Volkov's 9-cent washer became apparent over the following week. German forces at Kursk had committed their entire operational reserve of armor to Operation Citadel, gambling on achieving breakthrough before Soviet reinforcements could arrive. The Battle of Prokhorovka had failed to achieve breakthrough, and by July 15th, Soviet forces outnumbered German forces by 2.3 to 1 in armor and 3.1 to 1 in infantry. The German summer offensive collapsed, Hitler ordered withdrawal, and the initiative on the Eastern Front passed permanently to the Red Army. Soviet maintenance records from July 1943 documented the modification program's results with characteristic bureaucratic precision. Between July 11th and July 31st, Soviet maintenance battalions installed Volkov's washers in 4,027 T-34 tanks across all fronts. Transmission failure rates declined from 23% to 3.2% within 3 weeks. Average operational range before mechanical failure increased from 74 kilometers to 1,180 kilometers. Total maintenance man-hours required per tank per month declined by 37%. The cumulative effect was equivalent to adding 800 additional tanks to Soviet operational strength without building a single new tank. The Soviet system being what it was, Volkov received no public recognition for his contribution. He was promoted to senior welder at Tank Factory number 83 in August 1943, with a salary increase of 180 rubles monthly, approximately $9 at official exchange rates. He received no medal, no commendation, no mention in official histories. His personnel file contained a single notation dated July 15, 1943. Comrade Volkov's technical initiative contributed to improved transmission reliability. Recommend retention in current position. The notation was signed by Colonel Engineer Popov, who understood that the Soviet system rewarded collective achievement rather than individual brilliance. Colonel Vassin submitted an after-action report on July 20th that analyzed the Battle of Prokhorovka in exhaustive detail. The report contained 47 pages of tactical analysis, casualty statistics, and lessons learned. Page 34 included a section titled Mechanical Reliability Factors that noted, transmission modifications implemented on 11/12 of July proved decisive in maintaining operational armor strength during extended combat operations. Recommend immediate implementation across all tank units. The report made no mention of Volkov by name, describing the modification only as factory-recommended procedural improvement involving installation of spacer component in transmission assembly. Major Korzun's 181st Tank Brigade was awarded the Guards designation in August 1943, becoming the 36th Guards Tank Brigade in recognition of performance during July defensive operations. Korzun received the Order of the Red Banner and promotion to Lieutenant Colonel. His after-action report included specific mention of modified tanks' superior mechanical reliability, but attributed the modification to improved factory quality control procedures rather than individual innovation. The 24 modified tanks that survived Prokhorovka continued in service with the brigade through 1944, participating in 17 major engagements with a cumulative mechanical failure rate of 4.1%, compared to 19.7% for unmodified tanks in equivalent service. Sergeant Petrov, whose tank had been the first to receive Volkov's modification at Repair Station No. 1, survived the war and remained in the Soviet Army until 1961. He wrote in his unpublished memoirs, discovered in a Minsk archive in 1993, "On July 11th, a boy who looked too young to shave installed something in my transmission and told me it would not fail. I did not believe him because I had learned not to believe promises about Soviet equipment. But on July 12th, I drove my T-34 at maximum speed for 6 hours through the worst combat I ever experienced, shifting gears hundreds of times, maneuvering violently to avoid German fire, and the transmission never faltered. I do not know the boy's name, but I owe him my life, because if my transmission had failed during those 6 hours, I would have died in a burning tank on the steppes south of Prokhorovka." German intelligence eventually identified the transmission modification through examination of captured Soviet tanks in autumn 1943. A technical intelligence report dated October 14, 1943 noted, Soviet T-34 model 1943 tanks captured during recent operations show evidence of field modification involving installation of spacer washer in transmission assembly. Modification appears designed to address harmonic vibration problems in gearbox. Recommend analysis of potential application to German armor experiencing similar issues. The report's recommendations were never implemented because German tank production focused on new designs rather than fixing problems in existing vehicles, and because German industrial capacity was increasingly stressed by Allied bombing campaigns that disrupted parts supply chains. The final accounting of the Battle of Prokhorovka has been disputed by historians for 80 years, with German sources claiming tactical victory based on favorable loss ratios, and Soviet sources claiming strategic victory based on successful defense. The mechanical dimension of the battle has received almost no historical attention despite being arguably decisive. Soviet official histories mention transmission problems only in passing, and German histories ignore them entirely, focusing instead on tactical maneuvers and combat performance. The physical evidence of Volkov's contribution survived in archives. Tank Factory No. 183 production records from July 1943 show procurement of 127,000 steel washers, matching the specifications of Volkov's modification, representing enough components to modify every T-34 tank in Soviet service. Maintenance battalion records show installation of modifications in 4,127 tanks during July-August 1943. Field performance records show transmission failure rates declining from 23% to 3.2% over the same period. The correlation is precise, documented, and buried in maintenance archives that were classified until 1991. Dmitry Volkov continued working at Tank Factory No. 183 until 1947, when he transferred to a civilian machinery factory in Leningrad. He married in 1946, had 3 children, and died in 1983 at age 60 from lung cancer probably caused by decades of exposure to welding fumes. His obituary in the Leningrad Evening News was 4 lines. Dmitry Ivanovich Volkov, retired machinist, died Tuesday at age 60. Survived by wife Nina, children Yuri, Svetlana, and Mikhail. Funeral services, Friday at Municipal Cemetery. Veteran of Great Patriotic War. The washer modification remained standard procedure in Soviet tank production through 1955, when improved transmission designs eliminated the vibration problem. Between July 1943 and December 1955, Soviet factories installed variations of Volkov's modification in 47,600 tanks across multiple vehicle types. Total cost of modifications: approximately $4,084 at 1943 prices, or 9 cents per tank times 47,600 tanks. Total impact on Soviet armor effectiveness: immeasurable, but certainly worth more than the gross domestic product of many small nations. The Battle of Prokhorovka stands as the largest tank battle in history, involving approximately 1,500 tanks and 3,000 other armored vehicles engaged across a 30-kilometer front. The battle is remembered for strategic significance: the failure of Germany's last major offensive in the East, the beginning of permanent Soviet strategic initiative, the turning point that led eventually to Berlin. But the battle's outcome was determined not by strategy or tactics or courage or superior numbers, but by 2,400 steel washers, costing 9 cents each, installed by teenage factory workers in tanks during 4-hour repair procedures while German artillery searched for targets. The arithmetic of industrial warfare is often reduced to production statistics and casualty ratios, but sometimes the arithmetic is simpler. 9 cents times 2,400 equals $216, and $216 worth of steel washers installed at exactly the right moment in exactly the right place defeated a $200 million German offensive and changed the course of the Eastern Front. Generalfeldmarschall von Manstein had operational reserves of 6,012 tanks, representing Germany's finest armor technology and most experienced crews. The Soviet Union had a 19-year-old welder who noticed a vibration pattern and understood what it meant. The Germans lost because their transmissions worked as designed. The Soviets won because a factory worker fixed a transmission that didn't work as designed. The difference was 3 millimeters of spacing and 9 cents worth of steel. The consequences were 340 destroyed German tanks, 403 Soviet tanks saved from mechanical death, and a battle outcome that determined whether the Third Reich would break through to the Volga River or die slowly in the Russian winter of 1943-44. History remembers Prokhorovka for the courage of Soviet tankers who fought against superior German equipment and won through determination and sacrifice. History should also remember that courage is most effective when supported by transmissions that don't fail at critical moments, and that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat is measured not in divisions or corps or armies, but in millimeters of spacing and the observations of workers who understand their machines better than their supervisors realize. Dmitry Volkov never knew that his modification saved 403 tanks at Prokhorovka because Soviet security protocols prevented maintenance personnel from receiving battle outcome information. He never knew that his washers were installed in 47th U-600 tanks between 1943 and 1955 because production statistics were classified. He never knew that German intelligence analyzed his modification in October 1943 because enemy intelligence reports were not shared with factory workers. He died in 1983 believing that his contribution to the war effort was 18 months of welding transmission housings at Station 47 of the assembly line, 63 housings per shift, 23,000 welds total, none of them remarkable. But in the archives of Tank Factory No. 183, on page 847 of the July 1943 production log, there is a notation in black ink: Production Batch 7443, modified per Technical Bulletin 430711, spacer component installed per Worker Initiative, Volkov, DI Engineering Approval Popov, MY Operational Implementation, 11 July 1943. The notation is unremarkable, buried in thousands of similar entries documenting the incremental improvements that collectively transformed the T-34 from a flawed design with mechanical problems into the most effective tank of World War II. The notation represents the only official acknowledgement that Dmitry Volkov's 9-cent washer existed, that it mattered, and that sometimes the course of history turns not on the decisions of generals or the movements of armies, but on the observations of a teenage welder who understood that vibration at 180 cycles per minute meant something was wrong, and who had the intelligence to figure out what was wrong, and who had the initiative to fix it with hardware from a parts bin. The Battle of Prokhorovka ended at dusk on July 12, 1943. The battle over who won and why and what it meant continues.